Hear it after the program. But welcome everyone to our 10th session of our 2022 Racial Justice Training Series. We are so grateful to all of you for being with us this afternoon. In each of our sessions this year, we've explored a chapter in Professor Chris Henning's book, Rage of Innocence: How America Criminalizes Black Youth. In the past sessions, which we know many of you have joined, youth defenders and impacted young people advocates like yourselves, academic scholars, have joined Professor Henning in discussing the intersections of race, adolescence, and policing. Each of the chapters in her book is filled with narratives and research, data, and history that we hope can be used by all of you to strengthen youth defense by the young people who face the legal system across the country. And with our session today, we will have explored 10 of the 12 chapters of Chris's book and dug into content about adolescence, the importance of recreation and play for youth, youth expressions of culture, identity development, closing the school to prison pipeline, and so much more. We're grateful to all of you, our participants, for your ongoing enthusiasm and your appetite for the new ideas that are shared in each of these programs. We hope that you'll join us in 2023 for the final 2 chapters of Rage of Innocence in January and February. And then we hope you'll stay tuned for an announcement about our 2023 Racial Justice Training Series that will begin in April. And in the meantime, we hope if you're excited about learning new ideas and strengthening youth defense, that you will apply to participate in our Youth Defender Advocacy Program Summer Academy. Those applications are out and available. We can also put the link to that online. This is for youth defenders to additionally strengthen their practice and is another partnership program between the Galt Center and Georgetown Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative. So back to our program. Last month, we had an incredibly powerful discussion about the chapter on policing as trauma, covering how policing impacts the health and well-being of Black, Latino, Indigenous, and other youth. Today, we're going to focus specifically on the ways in which the legal system dehumanizes children of color and robs them of their childhood through extreme sentences. We're honored to be joined today by a powerful panel of speakers who I have the pleasure of introducing. We'll put their full bios in the chat so that you can learn more about them. I'm going to start with Eric Campbell. Eric, welcome. Eric is the founder and CEO of Spud Inc. Some people understand differently. Spud Inc. is a 501c3 nonprofit focused on using music as an alternate approach to decision-making. The mission of Spud Inc. is to connect generations through artistic expression. We'll hear Eric talk more about this during the program today. And in addition to running Spud Inc., Eric is raising a family, running a recording studio, and owns a branding company. Eric has done all of this while navigating returning to the community after facing 13 years in prison for a life without parole sentence at the age of 15. Eric, thank you so much for being with us today. Next up, we have Carmen. Thank you so much. Next up, we have Carmen Doherty. Many of us know Carmen best through her decade-long partnership in states to end the abominable youth prison system, her work to invest in community-based solutions, and her work to abolish the transfer of youth to adult court while she was with our partners at Youth First. Carmen is now excitingly the Deputy Executive Director at the Advancement Project, a next-generation multiracial civil rights organization that envisions a future where people of color are free, where they can thrive and be safe and exercise power. Carmen firmly believes in the Advancement Project's vision to drive by the genius of ordinary people and their movements. Racism will no longer exist and justice will be radically transformed. Welcome, Carmen. We're so happy to have you with us. Next up is Kristen Rome, one of our 2020 Ambassadors for Racial Justice, and now the co-executive director of the Louisiana Center for Children's Rights. Kristen was born and raised in New Orleans, and after graduating from Spelman College undergrad and Loyola New Orleans Law School, she opened a criminal defense practice with her father, where she maintained a focus on ending juvenile life without parole, successfully advocating for parole eligibility in several cases. Kristen's commitment to client-centered lawyering is now part of her practice and leadership at LCCR, where they run a specialized youth defense office where they defend New Orleans young people facing arrest and prosecution, and youth across Louisiana who face juvenile life without parole sentences. Welcome, Kristen. And of course, the reason we are all here, Professor Kristen Henning, the author of Rage of Innocence, the Bloom Professor of Law, and director of the Juvenile Justice and Clinic and Initiative at Georgetown Law. Chris has unbelievably been defending young people for 3 decades, despite the fact that she's still 25. She's mentored countless students who have gone on to become youth defenders. Chris inspires us all to do and be our very best in all we do. We're so grateful to you, Chris, for writing and imagining and bringing this work to light for all of us. Thank you so much for being with us. Okay, now, as we begin this program, we like to start by asking each of our powerful panelists for a 60-second response to the question, why is this conversation about the dehumanization of children through adultification, transfer, and severe sentences so important to you? I'm going to start with Eric. Eric, why is this conversation so important to you?
This conversation is extremely important to me firsthand because of my experiences. And after my experiences, when I come across a youth, I see the road that was paved before them that can lead them in that direction. Before incarceration, I came from a 2-parent household. I was up for a scholarship. I never was arrested. And I still fell to the pitfalls of that direction, that roadmap. And I see a lot of youth who probably have less than I had, who the odds of them going in that direction are even heightened. And that experience, this conversation is happening as we speak. Right now, that conversation is consistently, and it's an ongoing battle. And this is why I put my forth and effort in having this conversation every chance I get, because I am a full representation of that. And there's millions of Erics who don't get the opportunity, who don't get to have the conversation, don't get to have the support to flourish, to shine, and to show, or even take their experiences and do like I'm doing. So every time I have a conversation like this, I want to be a representation of those who never had the chance and those who may face it.
Eric, thank you so very much for being with us. I hope through this conversation we can inspire others to help young people flourish and shine and show. Thank you. Karen Doherty, the same question. Why is this conversation so important to you?
I don't know if I need 60 seconds. I want our kids to be free. I want Black people to be free. I want to abolish this system that's built on white supremacy, right? This dismantle harmful practices to young people that forever cripple them for their futures, for their communities. I believe in democracy as we see it falter in all pieces of our union as states in this country. And I feel like this is just one of those tools of white supremacy that keeps from people truly being represented in our system. So, whatever it takes to bring these harmful systems down, I'm there for it to free our people.
Thank you so much, Carmen. Let's shut this system down. Let's hope that we learn more about how to do that today. Thanks, Carmen, for being with us. Kristen, same question. Why is this conversation so important to you?
Thank you, Marianne. Of course, I second what Eric and Carmen said, but when I think about this, I approach the work that I do now as a mother. I'm a mother first. And so when I think about the future of the world, and we are, it's really easy for us to talk about things like climate change and the way that's going to impact our future. But when we think about what we're doing to children, and that what the future of the world is completely and totally depends on children, I am not, the world is not, we are on our way out. One day we will be elders and we will go on to transition and be ancestors and no longer be on this plane. And so in thinking about the way we treat children, I'm so concerned about what 30, 50, 60 years will look, 20 years will look like in terms of who will be here to continue the world and what is going on in the world. So that's why it's so important to me that we are having this discussion, because really and truly our future, but more really and truly our present depends on it.
Thank you so much, Kristen. So the future depends on this conversation. Thank you. Chris Henning, same question to you. Why is this conversation so important to you and what you do?
Yes, yes, yes. First of all, to all that has been said, I was nodding vigorously. So, in addition to what's been said, though, I think one additional reason that I want to put on the table is that we have come so incredibly far in our understanding about adolescent development and the adolescent brain. And for the most part, we have finally recognized and accepted adolescence and youthfulness as a mitigator, right? As a mitigating factor in the criminal legal system for many youth. But we are far, far less likely to recognize youthfulness as a mitigator for Black and Brown youth, right? And so part of what I am just so passionate about is, look, y'all, we know what works. We know what's right. We know what's wrong. And why don't we do it for Black kids? And it ties to all the things that have already been said about our racist history and, our lack of care and concern for Black children. And so I am excited to get into this conversation.
Thank you so much, Chris. Let's make it happen. So there's going to be so much learning here today. So grateful to all of you, our panelists and participants. I'm going to turn it over to Chris from here on out. Thanks everyone for being with us.
All right. Thank you, Marianne. It's awesome always to be a co-host with you in these programs. So look, Marianne, as you know, has already said that we're going to talk about the dehumanization of Black and Brown children. We're going to talk about both the dehumanization and adultification through the prosecution of children as adults and the imposition of severe sentences. But before we do that, I want to be clear, we all have to be clear that the dehumanization of Black children did not start this year. It did not start yesterday. It is very much part and parcel of our lineage. And by dehumanization, we are talking about the ways in which we view and treat people, right, as though they are less than human. It is the denial of the full humanness, the full humanity to which we are all entitled. When we talk about adultification, we're talking about the denial of childhood, right? And the denial of all the rights that have come along with that. So it's about viewing and treating children as though they're older, more mature, less deserving of the protections and the grace that society typically offers to its children. And the criminal legal system is just one of the many ways in which society has demonized children of color. And I think back, just as a word of history, right? Even when the progressive era child savers, right, started the first juvenile court, acknowledging that children were different from adults, they did not think that Black children were worthy of this differential treatment. They didn't think Black children were worthy of being rehabilitated. And instead, they focused their efforts in these new juvenile courts on assimilating white European immigrant youth into American society. And then even when sort of white immigrant youth began to assimilate, it was Black children in particular, and increasingly, Latino children who became disproportionately overrepresented in the system, right? So right from the outset of the first juvenile courts, and then more recently, our exaggerated fears about Black children, especially in the 80s and the 90s, led to very significant and harsh changes in the law, making it easier to transfer children to adult courts. After we open these adult courts, we say, no, not everybody is entitled to access to these children's courts, these youth courts. And so we're going to send some kids back into the adult system, and they made laws that made it easier to try children as adults for more offenses and to impose more severe sentences. And that's really what we're going to talk about. But one more thing, though, before we do that, I want us to understand what the extreme outcomes are of dehumanization. And so dehumanization has also meant that Black youth in particular, Black and Latinx youth second, in this calculus, were the most likely to be executed by the state. All right. And we do not have to go that far back to examine that history, the history of killing, literally state-sanctioned killing of Black folks, of Black children, little children. And so we wanted to begin with a very difficult video because we really want to situate what we're talking about when we talk about the dehumanization. So we want to talk about George Stinney and show you a video. He was the youngest person in the United States to be put to death by the electric chair. The young African-American child who was innocent. And this was in 1944, not even 80 years ago. So, and I want to be super clear that when we are playing videos, that they are difficult and you have to make your own choices about, what you can watch. But I have to say that our young people don't get to turn away from the realities and the dehumanization of what we're seeing. And this is a really, really powerful spoken word piece on the execution of George Stinney.
You're listening to Ill Poet Society.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. On March 23rd, 1944 in Alkaloo, South Carolina, these two white girls was riding bikes by the tracks that separate the whites and blacks. They was looking for maypop flowers, but within hours they came up missing. Wishing that I had never told the sheriff that I had seen them, the white girls' bodies turned up the next day in a ditch not too far from where I stay. I was even part of the search to find them, but I found myself being blamed for the murder of Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames, ages 11 and 8. I began to panic as the white folks' rage raced at a pace too swift for me to even contemplate getting someplace safe. And before I could even count to 5, I heard somebody say the nigger boy was the last one to see him alive. I wanted to run, but my feet couldn't move. So I couldn't run, and there was no point at this point because I was quickly surrounded by a white mob with guns. I resigned myself to the fact that I was going to be lynched that very instant, but in that same instant, the sheriff grabbed me and took me to jail. My name is George Junior Stinney Jr., and I'm being arrested for the killing of Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames, ages 11 and 8. The mob followed us all the way to the jail. Meanwhile, I'm crying for my life and wanted to see my mother, cause I wasn't guilty of nothing but being in the wrong place at the wrong time while being the wrong color. Small for my age, I was slightly built, but the interrogation proceedings began with a bunch of questions centered around the presumption of my guilt. You see, the good old boy reasoning wouldn't allow them to realize that at 5'1", 95 pounds, there was no way I could wrestle both girls to the ground, somehow manage to crush the skull of one while simultaneously subduing the other, and transporting both bodies away from the scene in broad daylight without being seen. But the resolve of the sheriff could not be understated because he decided he was leaving that room with a confession even if he had to fabricate it. He offered me ice cream and said that I could go home and he'd forget it if I just admit that I did it. Now, after hours of questioning with fear, exhaustion, and the naivete of my age combining to compromise my judgment, I admitted being the perpetrator of the incident and in that very instant relinquished my innocence. The sheriff left the room and I heard him say he just confessed that he was after sex. The little nigger boy just put the noose around his own neck. Best bet we get him to Charleston and out of sight. The lynch mob won't let the nigga survive the night. My name is George Junior Stinney Jr., and I'm being charged with the killing of Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames, ages 11 and 8. The next morning I was sitting in my cell and I heard an officer tell another that my father had lost his job, and he and my family had left town the previous night in fear of their lives. I hadn't signed anything and no one talked to me about an attorney, but the jury selection began at 10, ended around 12 for the trial itself to start at 2:30. I couldn't do no bargaining and I wasn't in a position to, and that's probably how my defense attorney ended up being the county tax commissioner. Now, blacks were not allowed in the courtroom, so you know there were none on the jury. Quick, fast, and in a hurry with no witnesses, transcripts, written confession, or evidence. After 10 minutes, I was sentenced to death with no hesitance. My name is George Junior Stinney Jr., and I have just been convicted of the double homicide of Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames, ages 11 and 8. By the time June 16th came, I resigned myself to the fact that I was going to die and convinced myself that I was not going to give them white folks the satisfaction of seeing me cry. Of this crime, I'm innocent. I done said it from the beginning, and my contention is not diminished one bit by your bigoted justice system or a death sentence from an all-white jury that deliberated my innocence for a whole of 10 minutes. I grabbed my Bible, and the guards walked me down the hall. A door at the end of the hall is all I saw. I walked in the room and handed the attendant my Bible and took a seat. But I was so small, the straps kept falling off and sliding down around my feet. The attendant looked at me and froze. I was too short to reach the face mask and electrodes. He took a second look and sat me on top of a stack of books. He stretched the electrodes to the limit to reach my head and cover my face with the mask is what he did, all of which was still too big. Then he pulled the switch. My body convulsed and twitched so much that my head came from under the bonnet, exposing my smoking nasal cavity and sizzling vomit. After 4 minutes, he turned off the power and my head lay tilted, with a sunken face, singed hair, and an eye missing. I'm sharing this with you so I'm not forgotten and the justice system is held accountable and in shame. Even though I may be long gone, don't give up trying to clear my name. My name is George Junior Stinney Jr., and I was executed for the double homicide of Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames, ages 11 and 8. And to this day, at 14, the youngest ever to be executed in the United States.
There are so many names that can be added to this list. And this is such an incredibly painful video to watch. And they're just, I'm almost at a loss for words here. But there's no other way to describe this other than cruel and inhumane. Cruel and inhumane. The execution of children. And folks may want to write this off as a relic of the past, but it's not that long ago. And as was very clear at the end of this video, that it still happens today, right? State sanctioned killing of Black and brown folks, right? Through the police killings of unarmed Black children. But even beyond that, the inhumanity in the ways in which we treat Black children plays out through our day-to-day practices in the criminal legal system, the prosecution and incarceration, solitary confinement of Black and brown children in the adult legal system. And so that's what we're really going to drive home. We could talk a lot more about George Stinney, but we really want to get to what is happening today on the ground, and we want to talk about what we can do about it. So we have wonderful panelists here to help us begin to unpack that. And I really want to start with Carmen. And there are folks who are on our Zoom who aren't in the trenches every day in this work and don't understand the landscape across the country. So, I mean, if you can give us, Carmen, really almost just a little 101 about how children end up in the adult court in the first place across the country. What are some of the pathways that children can end up in adult court?
Sure, and thank you. Definitely need a cleansing breath after that. And I'm really looking forward to digging into, probably later in the conversation, that was an example of an innocent child, right? And really talking about kids who do make mistakes and what that means in the context of public safety, I think is an even bigger conversation to have now. So looking forward to getting into that. So overall, you know, get a precise 50-state view of how many youth get charged as adults is impossible. There's no federal repository that collects this from states, but we're lucky to have the National Center for Juvenile Justice that's built a model to give these state estimates. And so in 2019, they estimated that about 53,000 youth were charged as adults in that year. And what's pretty miraculous is that's an 80% drop from the super predator era of the mid 1990s, when there was an estimated 250,000 youth who were exposed to the adult criminal justice systems. And that's even the stat we used just 10 years ago, looking at the 250 number. So that's a big round of applause to folks like us on the ground doing the work to get kids out of the adult system. You know, but it's also, we think about, it's a 30% decrease from the most recent estimate done in 2015. So we're seeing this precipitous drop of kids in the adult system. But big disclaimer here, the asterisk is the children that remain exposed to the adult criminal justice system are overwhelmingly youth of color. We say as we get deeper into the juvenile injustice system, the darker, the blacker, the more disparate it gets. So we're talking about the most racist form of our criminal justice system, or kids who have been transferred to the adult system. So there are three main pathways to get into the adult court. There is the age of jurisdiction, states that define youth under the age of 18 to be adults in the eye of the law. Those states cut them off at 16 or 17, you're automatically an adult. A second way is because of state law and statute mandates that youth are charged as adults for specific types of crime, usually more violent crimes, or crimes that involve a firearm. Those are considered automatic transfers to the adult system. And then generally someone, a judge or prosecutor, most likely has the discretion to waive a youth into adult court and decides when to do so. And there's a couple of variations of how they do that through waiver, direct charges, or direct file, excuse me. And it's done so with very few limitations, or really thinking about mitigating circumstances of the totality of the child. So I'll leave it at that as a little bit of the 101.
I love that. Thank you for, helping set the stage. And then, Kristen, you as one of our fabulous ambassadors from Louisiana, can you tell us, you represent young people with severe sentences in adult prisons in your state. Can you tell us about transfer laws in Louisiana? Because I think one of the things that really resonates with what Carmen just said is that every state is different, right? On this, what does Louisiana look like?
Yeah, every state is different, but generally Louisiana does things similarly to the way Carmen described. So the age here is 15. 15 is the age that a young person can be transferred to adult court. And there are an enumerated list of crimes for which a young person will be, the adult court has automatic jurisdiction over these cases. The discretion in Louisiana is completely left up to the district attorney. And as most people can imagine, most of the district attorneys in Louisiana are white men. And outside of New Orleans and I would say Baton Rouge, are more conservative white men. But the really interesting thing is in New Orleans, we have what folks love to call a progressive district attorney. And I say that because our progressive district attorney ran on a promise to not transfer children to adult court, and almost immediately started transferring children to adult court. And so that is kind of indicative of what we're experiencing in Louisiana, that someone who is considered progressive, that folks will call progressive even now, is willing to transfer children to adult court and is not very concerned about having many discussions about the harmful impact of that. The other big thing that Carmen kind of mentioned is this age of 17. And in Louisiana, at one point, I think 6 years ago, something like that, a 17-year-old would be automatically tried as an adult in Louisiana. And so LCCR did this huge campaign called Raise the Age, where we advocated at the legislature to raise the age to 18 so that 17-year-olds, while they could still be transferred to adult court, they would automatically be in juvenile court first, and then the transfer process would have to happen. What we found in this last legislative session with this very harmful narrative nationally about a false narrative about an uptick in juvenile crime is a really hard push to roll back raise the age. And to be clear, raise the age was passed with bipartisan support because it not only made good financial sense, but also it just put us in alignment with the rest of the country, because most states see 17-year-olds as children and allow them to be in juvenile court. And so at LCCR, we are gearing up for this next legislative session to play defense, because we know that raise the age will likely be rolled back. But I think the biggest things that I kind of want people to understand about Louisiana is when we are talking about a progressive DA in New Orleans who ran with a promise to not transfer children and is still transferring children, is pretty bad here.
That's huge, right? And it shows how extraordinarily powerful the narrative is. And we've talked about the narrative multiple times already, the narrative of the 90s, right? You know, the narrative, you know, from the onset of the first juvenile courts in America, that narrative of fear, of threat, of danger about Black children drives everything. So even a quote unquote progressive district attorney is influenced. So let me turn to Eric. So, you know, Kristen said that in Louisiana, a child can be tried as an adult as early as 15. And indeed, Eric, you found yourself sentenced to adult prison at the age of 15. Can you just, you know, sort of, you know, set the stage? And we're so, you know, just incredibly, you know, blessed to have you and your willingness to share the story as a way of educating others. But if you could help set the stage for how you ended up sort of in adult court, like what city and state were you in, and whether or not there was an automatic transfer for you. And most importantly, really helping us understand that you can talk about this now, but at the age of 15, did you understand the legal framework back then?
Yes. At the age of 15, I had no understanding of what was taking place, as well as there wasn't any translation of what was occurring. In New York, what is interesting, and back then I didn't really understand the workings of it, there isn't really a juvenile court. You have a family court with most of the case, not most, all the cases, you have to be a youthful offender. Once you become a juvenile offender, everyone in New York City usually goes to criminal or Supreme Court. So we were automatically placed in adult settings for sentencing, regardless. But what was interesting, while we were incarcerated, we realized that it was regional, because the 5 boroughs held tight to this practice. But in places like Long Island, where we were watching some of our white counterparts who were getting arrested for some of the same charges, were still in youthful offender charges or in family court, receiving different sentences. For me, the first day of my arrest, excuse me, the first court day after my arrest was the only day I was in family court. And my next court day, which was about 2 months later, I went to criminal court one time, and then I was transferred to Supreme Court after that for the rest of my proceedings. Why I was transferred, how I was transferred, being explained, none of that was understood or expressed. It was just seen seemingly as a process. And at that age, you don't know what to ask. Court is court. I'm incarcerated, I want to go home. We have no concept of the odds that were stacked against us or the penalties that we were going to face for these different categorized court settings. But in New York, there's basically youthful offender and everything else is an adult.
It's really powerful. There's so much in that, this idea that no one explained, right?
No.
That who was by your side, no lawyer, judges, no advocate, this just shuffling of you into adult court, just in many ways is really terrifying and powerful. Can you say a word? Do you remember your lawyer at that stage in your life?
So my first lawyer was the 18B, which is a court-appointed attorney. And the first day that I meet him, he comes to my cell and he says, if we plead guilty, we could get 5 to life. This is before I saw a judge. I'm fresh. I mean, again, I was arrested probably 15 hours before. That was his first conversation with me. And immediately from then, the feel of defeat, confusion, not knowing what's going on, and then you're presented into a courtroom. And when I walked into the courtroom for the very first time, it was like a scene from Charlie Brown. It was like, wah, 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 wah. I knew not anything that was occurring. And the only word that I remember hearing was remand. And I had no clue what that meant. And I actually thought I was going home when I heard that. And that was when I realized from that point on, the progression was going to be through courts. I was going to have to go through a trial to be released, or somehow miraculously have this case dismissed.
Wow. The words you're using, defeated, confusion, are really powerful concepts. And, remember standing in the courtroom and hearing, do you remember the day you heard what your sentence would actually be? Do you remember that day?
Yeah. That moment, standing in front of the judge when they brought me out in the cuffs, and the word hardware, this was the first time I heard the word hardware pertaining to the cuffs and shackles. When they actually placed the cuffs and shackles on me, that was the first feeling that I wasn't human. They didn't interact with me as a human. They didn't speak to me. It was through me. It was like I was a product being moved. I felt so detached from reality. Going into the courtroom, I thought of every movie that I saw, every painful moment in life that I captured in visuals. When I walked into that courtroom, it felt like the weight of the world. But it felt like no matter how loud I was able to scream, I would be unheard. It was the weirdest, and it was new. It was a new feeling. I never experienced that. And it was like a whole conversation about me that I couldn't even partake in. I didn't know how to partake in. It was just happening. And it was snowballing right before my eyes. And I remember when I had to get escorted out, it was like I floated.
Wow.
I came in, didn't know what was going on, and I left even worse, because now I don't know what just happened, but I know it was all about me. And that right there just creates this scatter in your head where you will almost do anything not to go through that again.
Wow. And we'll come back and we'll talk about, lengthy sentences and what does it mean to think about the absence of possibility. But in that moment, at 15, feeling voiceless, and conversations are being had about you and not with you, right? Is a really, really powerful insight that all of us on this Zoom should be really paying attention to. So I want to talk about serious violent crime. And I think both Kristen and Carmen have alluded to this notion. Carmen, you definitely right out the gate talked about, look, what is it that children are being sent to adult court for, right? And I think most people believe that every time a child goes to adult court, they must have engaged in some really horrendous, antisocial, some would even go far as to say demonic, activity, right? That they are violent beyond repair. That is the narrative that's at play that causes folks to want to roll back in Louisiana, the raise the age. But, what we know about adolescents is they're impulsive, they're reactive, they're emotional, they're influenced by their peers. They don't think ahead to the long-term consequences. Some of what I was talking about earlier, right? We know so much more about adolescent development now, but that, even when children are sent to adult court for the most serious violent outcomes, we recognize that even those violent outcomes are started or initiated as some normal adolescent behavior. And so I wanted to ask both Carmen and Kristen to comment on that. Have you seen that in your work? Can you think of cases of children who start off being children, doing something, really, to be quite frank, foolish adolescent behavior, but they end up with a really serious outcome or consequence, even someone being killed? And can you help us understand, what that looks like? I'll start with you.
Well, I can start. So I think, I'll start by saying anecdotally, I can say that what we see is that the overwhelming majority of children who are transferred to adult court are being transferred for things like armed robbery. And it does not always require a violent outcome. And so I really love, Chris, how you framed it, like there is the act and there is the outcome of the act. So just anecdotally, we are not seeing children commit acts that are heinous and violent. We're seeing them commit acts that are pretty foolish, that sometimes have these bad outcomes. So I can think of a couple examples in Louisiana, in Louisiana, but particularly in New Orleans, that I've seen really in the past three or four or 5 months. So there was both carjackings. One last month, a 15-year-old was sentenced to 55 years for an armed robbery. And the only injury that occurred as a result of that armed robbery was the child rolled over the victim's foot. And so no one was killed, and that child was sentenced to 55 years. Another really big story here in New Orleans was a carjacking where, and I got to briefly work on the case. And so what I know, I watched all the surveillance footage and, kind of saw the evidence. And what I know, and I know from talking to the young people that were charged with the crime, is that they had been expelled from school. They had absolutely nothing to do. They were, the literal words were, we were bored. And they were walking to Smoothie King, and on the way to Smoothie King, they saw a woman sitting in the car, and one of them said, we should try to take her car. And so they kind of circled around the car. You can see them kind of circling around the car. One of them grabbed the car door. I believe they maced the woman, and the other kids came, it kind of went left. And the woman, as she was pulled from the car, her arm got stuck in the seatbelt. And when the child pulled off, she was unfortunately dragged and killed. And so there was this terrible outcome. But what no one talked about is the act itself, and how the act itself was not this terrible, intentional, violent thing. It was a thing that stemmed from poor education and these children being expelled, and no one really, not having services around them to ensure that there was something for them to do during the day. And then just it stemmed from boredom. And then honestly, because of the way their brains worked, it just turned into this chaotic situation that ended in this unfortunate circumstance. But the narrative was this narrative of these violent, murderous children. So yeah, that is what we see most commonly, that children are just behaving foolishly and not thinking through things, and that the outcome is something that they didn't expect.
Right.
Yeah, and I echo all of that. All of it is like unintended consequences of adolescent behavior, right? Not to minimize the harm that is done, but we don't focus on making victims whole in our criminal justice system. I think that's just the reality and a false narrative that's been fed to us forever. But young people, there across the country, we've seen kids steal cars. That's been translated into carjackings. And the unintended consequences is because they are poor drivers, someone has been hit and killed, right? Which is horrific. Was that the intent when that young person was like, let's go for a joyride today? No, it wasn't. But those are the cases that get transferred to the adult system across this country. So it rarely focuses on the child when we transfer kids, but really focuses on those unintended consequences and the harm, but the remedies are never to make it whole again. So I echo everything Kristen has said. It is a lot of the adolescent development pieces. It is looking at kids in schools and the interactions with school resource officers, which always escalate because of the power dynamics and the white supremacy of police forces. So you see some of those kids being transferred from school-based incidences as well, because now you have a police officer, state-sanctioned person in power saying X, Y, and Z happened, and this kid has to be automatically transferred. So it's a lot of the pieces of it, and not to not talk about young people in a way that helps them really truly be rehabilitated and be able to come back to the society is where we're also failing. And I know we'll talk about that, but it's just, we're just failing. We're just failing these kids all around. And I just want to point out, we haven't mentioned this, we're still in a pandemic. All of the data that has come out, which is now starting to come out around what is happening with our young people, the mental health crisis, the increase in suicide, the issues at school, how far behind we are with school issues. Like, it's just, we don't talk about that enough, and what's happening in our communities that really do perpetuate some of these malices in our communities right now.
Both of you, such powerful points. I mean, as I listen, what I'm hearing is this really clear statement of all the ways in which the criminal legal system fails everyone, right? Like, we, of course, listening to that story that you told, Kristen, feel empathy for the woman who was dragged and killed and her family. Unequivocal empathy, but we fail her too when we have the wrong response in the criminal legal system. Carmen, you put it beautifully. We're not making victims and their families whole at all. And then this notion of like, how do we respond to young people? And society wants to hold children accountable, but we have to hold children, quote unquote, accountable, consistent with their age, right? Their educational background, their, life circumstances and societal failures. And both of you talked about that beautifully, the failure of education and healthcare and just inattentiveness, poverty in our country. And we don't talk about that. So I really just really appreciate your comments there. And then, listening, I immediately thought back to Eric's quote. Eric, you just said that this thing about people were having conversations about you, right? But it's, about you and not with you. And I know from talking to you earlier that you felt like the people who were talking about you had done nothing to get to know you and to know your circumstances. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, just to tag on some of the circumstances to elaborate a little bit more about my case. It was a felony murder. My co-defendant said he wanted to rob someone, and it goes back to those foolish decisions, right? And in that time, I didn't respond to him. I didn't want to do it, but I didn't respond to him because I didn't want to be soft. I didn't want to be scared. We spent the whole day together. To eventually he walked into a grocery store and I stood outside. About 5 minutes, I walk in and he has a gun out. And I say to him, yo, what you doing? And in that moment, the owner grabs the gun. There's a struggle. He shoots the owner. I get hit in the head with a bat and I'm knocked out. I wake up, my co-defendant's gone. I wake up to them looking over me with a bat. I run out. And my charge was second-degree murder. This is what I took a plea to, second-degree murder. Even with my co-defendant who was arrested before me, making his statement of what he did, just being there, automatically I was placed on a murder charge. So that's how quick and how simple it can happen. In theory, the charges for a youth or a young Black man to be charged. And having that conversation, going back to what you asked about the conversation about me, and not having it with me, after those charges are or mentioned or placed, that's the conversation. So here it is, I am actually fighting a murder case to a scene I walked into. Everywhere I go from that point on, that's what I'm faced with. That conversation of the murder, that rap sheet, that folder that sits down that everyone gets to read before they meet me. And that's how every court date was. When I walked into there, I was a young Black man committed a murder. Forget the circumstances, forget the statements, even forget the evidence. I was a young Black man, and that was the conversation. And it was never, what can we do to add to this? It was always in the direction of, we have to penalize, and not penalize over the circumstances, not penalizing over the action, penalize to the charge. And that's
so that's the context, and that's the conversation. And I was about to say there was a conversation about the charge and not about the child, but it actually wasn't even about the charge because of the lack of meaningful testing of the evidence. It was a conversation about the outcome, right? About the death of, right? The shooting of the person, and not about the evidence that would explain your role or lack of role in it, and certainly not about you as a person. And so really powerful lived experience of what we're talking about. So then the other piece that we really want to drive home, and Carmen already did this as well as setting to set the stage for us, is the data on racial, disparities, right? We're talking about, we cannot leave this alone, right? When we talk about the transfer and the prosecution of children as adults, we are talking disproportionately about Black and brown children. And so, Carmen, you started a bit with us with the national data. Let me pause and ask Kristen, like, what does, race look like? How does race manifest in Louisiana when we're talking about transfer of children to adult court?
Well, the most telling piece is that no one tracks the data except LCCR. We're the only folks tracking the data, and our data is not as accurate as we would like it to be, because tracking data is hard when folks aren't providing you with the information. So for us, it's a lot of calling around, it's a lot of following news stories, in asking district defenders to give us some numbers, but really it's an imperfect system. But what we can tell is that the overwhelming majority of young people who are transferred to adult court, definitely somewhere over 85%, are Black children. And I think, one of the numbers out there in terms of New Orleans is that last year, 100% of children, probably for a few years, in my experience, seeing things that they were Black children. So I think the most telling thing again is that the data is not out there. Last year, when we were every year we've tried to at least bring or support a bill to abolish JLWOP in Louisiana. And one huge conversation that came out of last year's legislative session is a legislator actually asked for numbers. And I was able to say to him, the numbers barely exist. No one's tracking the data. And I was able to give him some of our data. And he turned and looked at the Louisiana District Attorneys Association, which is kind of the biggest roadblock we have to creating some change for young people. And they were, caught with their pants down, as folks say, because they were like, we have no idea. And it was crazy for the legislator to imagine that, wait, you guys are transferring children to adult court and no one's tracking the race of these children. And of course, the response to that from the district attorney was, well, their race is not important to us. We're not transferring them because they're Black, we're transferring them because they committed a crime. And I know we'll talk about this later, Chris, but like that fails to account for implicit racial bias. And the impact that we know that has on the criminal legal system and the way system actors make decisions. So that's the really unfortunate part, that no one's really paying attention to the numbers.
And I got to say, before I turn back to Carmen, as I listened to that, I heard two things: that it could either be, sort of a benign neglect in failing to collect the data, right? We don't collect the data because, race doesn't matter. We're just going, based on the offenses. But the other side, right, the more nefarious reading of that is they don't collect the data because they want, to act on their racial biases without being held accountable. So the data collection piece is so incredibly important. Both you and I'll turn back to Carmen have made this comment about, like, the data just isn't being tracked and collected in the ways in which it should be. And you gave us, some introductory thoughts about or insights into the national data on transfer. Carmen, is there anything else you wanted to add?
Yeah, I can add a little bit about the actual incarceration piece of young people who are transferred. And the data I have is from 2018, because of course, any data that is going to be old. So Lord knows what this looks like post-COVID. But despite Black youth making up percent the total youth population in the United States, they comprise 63% of the total youth detained pending judicial waiver or awaiting criminal court hearing. So pre-trial detention in an adult jail, they made up 63% of the population there for youth. Again, talking about the deeper we get into the system, the more disparate it is. And then looking at the transfer numbers, just noticing for white youth, they dropped between 2005 and 2018 percentage-wise. For white youth, they went from 45% of transfers to 32%. In that same time, Black youth went from 39% to 51%. So, we applaud, like, we're shrinking the youth system, but it's getting more exact, and it's really showing itself to be even more racist, right? It's showing its true colors and what it was meant to do. And that's to basically traumatize black boys and girls, and, like we were talking about, dehumanizing them. And Eric, it really stood out that you're saying that, you couldn't tell your story. And the reality is, the story for Black boys is told for them. The narrative is set. Every story is the same about a Black boy who's been arrested. So that story is set in stone since the beginning of time. And it, I know we'll talk more about ways to advocate, but that is a big one, is shifting the narrative and having the people and the power to do that.
Hugely important, hugely important. And sort of the last question on this, driving home this point about racial disparity, I want to turn back to Eric. Is precisely that. I wanted, just to hear it almost from the anecdotal lens. What does it look like from the inside when you're incarcerated at the age of 15? Were you aware of racial disparities? Could you see it in the courts, in the detention facilities, in the prison? And now with your work at SPUD, do you see those racial disparities play out?
Yeah, you see them then, and you most see them clearer now. But at that age, it's so consistent. That's the way. That's how we automatically embrace it. This is how it is. Not realizing that how much infrastructure and effort is put to create these conditions and keep these conditions upheld. We just accept them because we go through them. I tell the story of my first day going into the facility. They had these underwear bins, and there was a white young brother came in, and they gave him his whites, and then they told me to pick from the bin. And when I reached into the bin, that was the laundry bin. In that very moment, I knew what I was facing, but it happened so consistent. It was like, I'm not a white boy. And I took from the bin a dirty pair of drawers. That's how common it was, that it wasn't even secretly done. It was blatant. And the consistency of it, which is scary, it almost starts to create an acceptance of this is what it is for us. And that's how, while we were in these juvenile detention facilities, we embraced it. This is what it is for us. And we had this phrase, we just got to thug it out. And that was the mind frame, because we had no other way of expressing or saying it. Even expressing this felt wrong. To whom? We didn't even know how to do that, where to go with that, because we were surrounded by it. So it was like, you keep your head low, mouth shut, and you keep trucking.
Wow. I mean, every time you add a new layer to this, it's just powerful and painful. I mean, to see it that explicitly, right? White boys get new underwear in prison, and the Black boys got to pick from the bin. It's just tragic. And that even at the age of 15, you could see it. And it was just so part and parcel of what was before you. So what we want to move to now, we've talked about this landscape of transfer, is to talk about lengthy sentences, right? And what do we mean when we talk about severe lengthy sentences? What does that actually look like? And so I'm going to start with Kristen. Obviously, once a child gets transferred to adult court, they can face all of the same sentencing outcomes as an adult. And you have been representing young people who have been sentenced to life without the possibility of parole for behavior that they committed or allegedly committed when they were children. And so again, because we have at least some listeners who are not lawyers in the trenches doing this work, I want to again give just a quick, 1, 2, 1, 2, what is a life without parole sentences, and about how prosecutors are seeking life without parole sentences for children in Louisiana.
Yeah, so this is one of those very tough conversations to have with our clients, because I think the common belief, when you're watching Law and Order or whatever, is that like life is 25 to life, 10 to life, 20 to life. In Louisiana, life literally means life. We actually, when we talk about it, we talk about it as a sentence to die in prison, because that is actually what it is. It is a death sentence, and you die in prison, and you go to what is one of the most notorious adult maximum security prisons in the country, Angola, Louisiana State Penitentiary, a former plantation for enslaved people, and you are sent there literally to die. And that is what a life without parole sentence is in Louisiana. Currently, based on some plenty of advocacy that's been done by LCCR as well as our predecessor, JJPL, we've been able to narrow the scope of young people who are receiving that sentence. So now in Louisiana, only children convicted of first-degree murder can be sentenced to life without parole. But children are very often charged with first-degree murder, and still being convicted of first-degree murder. And the sentence of LWOP is still being handed down in Louisiana, and it's not an uncommon sentence. The U.S. Supreme Court told us in Miller versus Alabama that it is a sentence that should be reserved for only the worst of the worst, and that it should be rare that a child is sentenced to life without parole. But that's not what we're seeing at all in Louisiana. We're seeing that the sentence is still pretty common, and that in many, many, many cases, what we're finding is that not only do district attorneys not know, but defense attorneys and judges do not know that it is unconstitutional to sentence a child to die in prison without a sentencing hearing. And in fact, recently in New Orleans, so we expect New Orleans to have like more of a, because we have a progressive DA, and because this is where, progressive and we expect folks to know the law. But we recently came across a case, and again, like, this is our way of tracking data, like we're just catching things where we can, following the news. And we ended up finding this case where a young person was convicted of second degree murder and sentenced to life without parole by a judge in New Orleans, represented by a really great attorney in New Orleans. So yeah, we are still sentencing children to die in prison. And unfortunately, the law is not very widely known. Folks do not know what is legal and what is illegal.
Okay, that's terrifying on so many levels, right? That all of the key actors, including the defense attorney who is appointed or hired to stand in the gap between the state and his life, are not aware of the law. So that makes my stomach hurt. The other thing that you said is this notion of it's only, a severe sentence of that nature is only reserved for the worst of the worst. You hear lingo on the street called the wows, right? And what's so terrifying is I hate the term so incredibly much because it has become so like co-opted by the narrative of fear. Right. So there is no such thing. I mean, like the worst of the worst is the blackmail by definition, like what, Carmen and Eric are talking about. So it's devastating to think about that.
I was just going to add, Chris, and thinking about the worst of the worst and how subjective it is, it goes back to what Carmen said. The bigger and the blacker, the worst.
That's right. That's right. Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. And tell me, look, I'm going to state the obvious. I just want to make sure everybody is on accord. We want to close all loops. Kristen, why is a life without the possibility of parole sentence so extraordinarily inappropriate and inhumane for a teenager, for an adolescent?
Yeah, so I think any sentence in adult court is inappropriate for a teenager. But certainly a life without parole sentence is because of what the science very clearly tells us about a child's brain. And we don't need science to tell us that, right? Because we've all been teenagers and we all can look back on our lives and whether we did something that was considered criminal or whether we did something that was just foolish, we know that we all engaged in behaviors at 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 21 that we would not engage in right now. And so like the science very clearly tells us that the adolescent brain is still developing, but really what we know and what is clear is that the prefrontal cortex is what is not developed, right? And so that the way I describe it when I'm talking to folks about it is that teenagers are all gas and no brake. And so they're really risky and they love quick rewards. What they don't have the ability to do is, if I can kind of, the way I explain it to my clients and, new attorneys when they come on is like, if somebody pisses you off as an adult, you might think to yourself, I want to punch this person in the face. But then your brain does this thing where it's like, but it's not worth it. Because if I punch this person in the face, I'm going to lose my job, I'm going to be arrested, or then I'm going to have a fight in the middle of the street and I'm going to look crazy. And so your brain has the time to, all of these connections are happening between your brain so that you can do a risk assessment with whatever action it is that you are thinking about engaging in. And the adolescent brain just does not have the capacity to do that. It's not that they don't want to do that. It's not that teenagers don't want to do that assessment. It's literally that the brain doesn't have the capacity to do it. And then I think the other thing that is not a part of the conversation, well, often not a part of the conversation when we talk about adolescent brain development, is that this science is based on the normal brain. That a brain that is normal and healthy and functioning well. And what I can tell you about the children that I work with and the adults that I work with is that all of them, 100% of them have experienced childhood trauma. An overwhelming majority of them have experienced extreme poverty. And so these things that are normal or common rather, but not necessarily normal, we look at them as like, oh, they experienced that. Like plenty of children experience that. I experienced that too. I didn't go out and kill somebody or, but truly, the sentence is so inappropriate, Chris, to get back to your question, because we know that children have the capacity to change. They will grow, they will develop, they will learn from their mistakes. They will learn how to assess risks and not make risky decisions, but they have to have time to grow. And so when we sentence a child to die, we rob them of that opportunity to grow and become who they're going to be. And worse, this is a critical time in your development. Your brain is becoming what it is going to be. And so if we are taking children and we're putting them in these circumstances and in these environments that cultivate violence, that teach them, I am not worth clean and new underwear, but white children are. This is what we are creating something in them. We are turning them into criminals. We're turning them into people that want to enact violence, instead of allowing their brains to be nurtured and developed in a way that they can contribute meaningfully to our society and we can benefit from their gifts.
Just so powerful and painful. And, in Louisiana, your life sentence, like you said, is sentenced to die. It's natural life. In other places where life is something short of natural life, we're setting these kids up, right? Like for complete failure, both with inside and outside, the facilities. We as a society with this response are doing more harm than good. Like we state that our goal is public safety. We're doing anything but, that. And we're, engaged in inhumane treatment. And I just have to ask, because of this, conversation we're having about race. So before I move back to Carmen and Eric, what are your numbers, your racial disparity on a juvenile life without parole sentence in the state of Louisiana?
I do not have the exact number in front of me, and it is escaping me now. But we were actually quoted in our data was quoted in the Jones decision. And I want to say that since Miller, it is somewhere in the 90 percentile, since Miller, which told us that this should be a rare sentence, somewhere in the 90 percentile of children who have been convicted of first-degree murder have received LWOP sentences.
Wow. And
I think it's 97, I could be wrong, or maybe 93.
And those are Black and brown children?
Absolutely, 100%. Yes.
100%. That's what I thought. 100%.
Yes.
Wild. And let me ask you, Carmen, at that national level, right? So we talked about juvenile life without the possibility of parole or death in prison. And we know that happens in other states, but that's not the only type of severe sentence. And I really like Kristen's comment, like even one day in an adult prison is a day too long for a child where it's inappropriate to hold them. But can you give us a quick, summary of what are the other types of severe sentences that young people see in other states?
Yeah, and I don't know if you want me to talk about some of the Supreme Court cases here. Would that be helpful, or just talk generally?
I think talk generally about what the range of sentencings might be. Right.
And I think it depends, right? State, we all said it, 1 day is enough, 1 hour is enough to change like the trajectory of a child when they're in a facility. So we see a range. I've met with young people in states like New York and New Jersey who were sentenced as adults at 14, 15. I mean, Eric can relate, and who came out 10 years later. Young people in Virginia who were sentenced at 16, 17 that I've worked with who were in there for 30 years. So it's a range, and it is so dependent on the judge and the prosecutor. And I think we're all familiar with how plea bargaining goes. The majority of these cases end up in a plea bargain, which oftentimes fails both the victim and the client and the young person. So while it isn't the JLWOP, it is a lifetime for a young person who is developing their sense of self at 13, 14, 15, 16, developing their relationships. And now their relationship is in a prison, right? And that is such a pivotal time in our lives. Let's all think back when we were in high school, the conflicts we could deal with, the relationships with our families, all of those pieces, that everything just seems so much bigger than life. Like not getting a call from a friend could like ruin your weekend. And what these young people have to deal with, young women going through puberty in a prison cell without the guidance of their families, their mothers, their grandmothers to teach them things. So, it's all too much. A day, a year. I mean, it's too much. It's too painful. And we're not doing a good job of protecting these young people.
It's huge. And thank you so much for elevating, the voices of girls too, and how their circumstances are unique in these adult prisons. And I want to turn back, again to Eric, and you started talking about this. But when I have heard you talk, when I met you and heard you talk about when you were sentenced to life without the possibility of parole for 7 years, or 7 to life, I guess is the way it was put and read to you. I remember you're saying that you didn't even hear them say that. You didn't even hear them say the word 7 to life. Can you take us back? What was your mindset at the time of your sentencing?
So I took the plea third day in trial.
Mm.
The sad factor of taking the plea wasn't based on evidence or guilt. It was mainly because I was a young Black man on trial. This is the information that was put before me. You know what they're going to do to you. So that was the biggest factor of taking the plea. But I remember my lawyer at the time, we actually had a paid lawyer. My father put up the house for Steve Stone. And he says to me, you have a year, you do 2 more years. 1 year as a juvenile facility and 1 as an adult facility, and you come home on good time. So you'll do 3 years in total, but you have a year in. And he said, take the time. So when I heard I had 2 more years, to me, that was life. 2 more years was like, they could have told me I took a plea to 1 billion years to life. It didn't compute what I was facing. 2 years, I couldn't tell you what I was gonna do in 4 months, who I was in 4 months. So 2 years. And after I took the plea to 7 to life, I still didn't even understand what I took the plea to, because you don't get good time on a life sentence. Mm-hmm. So I had to do the whole duration of 7 years before I go to a parole board. So then that process was another scramble in my brain, because here I am focusing on 2 years, and I actually had 6 more to do before I actually went to my first parole board, which I went to 4 parole boards in total.
That's so
So
wild.
I didn't understand. I'm sorry, I didn't understand at all. To gauge time, that process of gauging time was almost impossible for me at that age. I had no concept of it. It was now, and then you're telling me 2 more years. I'm already thinking of flying cars and laser guns and the world changing far beyond my imagination. I wasn't even in the courtroom during that time. I was trying to picture life as I can.
Wow. And yeah, it's a scramble, this notion that time, 2 years sounds like life to you, right? And that you were trying to understand that's what you thought you were going to get, and only later found out that what you had actually gotten was 7 to life, and that you had many more years to go before you would even be considered for parole, if I understand correctly. And let me make sure I understand. You started off with a court-appointed lawyer, and then your father put up property in order to get a paid lawyer. And it was the paid lawyer who helped you understand what the actual sentence was, or how did that play out?
So the first lawyer was appointed by the courts. First day said he could get me 5 to life. Sadly, I actually took a plea, which was more than what he was offering me. And we brought that information back to my father. And he said, we can't do that. So he put the house up to get a lawyer. My lawyer never explained to me. I remember going back after court, back to the detention center, and brothers who've been there longer than me asking me, yo, did you look over your court papers to see if there's any inconsistencies? Now, we're talking about probably, I was 15, he probably was 17. So he already spent 2 years fighting court. So he had a little more edge. I went back to my lawyer and I, refer this information. Can I get my court papers? And he turns to me and he says, I'm the attorney. I'm the professional. After that, there isn't anything I can say. He's the attorney. He's the professional. He got paid for it. So from that point on, I just showed up to court, and whatever he relayed to me, I took it as factual and trusted everything in this man. And even him relaying the plea bargain to me was incorrect, because there wasn't a 3-year good time. I was actually taking a plea to life with the possibility of parole in 7. Even that was explained to me incorrect.
I have to say, every time I talk with you and hear your story, my heart hurts. And so I love that, I just so appreciate you for being here again. Probably say that more times, and for all that you've done. And we're going to talk later about how you have used what you've learned in the system to help other people. But before we get there, I really want us to think about the narrative one more time, right? And to talk about the root, right? The root of racial disparities in our system, because that's really what this conversation is all about. And those of you on Zoom who've been coming to these monthly webinars have heard us talk about the research, right? The growing body of research on implicit racial bias and explicit racial biases, and how those biases impact perceptions of guilt, innocence, adolescence, and what is considered to be an appropriate sentencing. But there are a couple of really important studies that are completely spot on with the conversation that we're having today, that help us understand how it is that a child gets sentenced in these ways. A Black or a brown child gets sentenced in these disproportionately severe ways. And we'll put in the chat the links to some of the studies. I will point out to you that there is an older study back from 1998. I think is one of the most, significant studies that we found that really started folks understanding how it is that we get to this place. And that was a study involving probation officers, right? In which researchers looked at the ways in which probation officers were given the exact same cases, right? Same case in terms of charges, same case in terms of severity of outcome, same case in terms of the backgrounds of the childs. But one child is white and one child is Black. And invariably, even when kids are charged the same and have similar upbringing and challenges in their lives, folks, probation officers in particular, are more likely to perceive that Black child as really beyond redemption, more likely to be to recidivate, more likely to be culpable because they are antisocial, lacking remorse, not taking the proceedings seriously, whereas that white child is perceived to be, people have sympathy and empathy for a difficult home environment, even though the Black child and the white child were raised the same. So it goes back to some of those old studies in 1998. Fast forward, right, to two more recent studies, one in 2012 and one in 2014. 2012, the researchers looked specifically at the ways in which implicit racial bias operates in juvenile life without parole sentences, JLWOP sentences, and found that even when participants in the study understood the mitigating effects of adolescence, even when they were sympathetic to children and wanted to give the child the benefit of rehabilitation, they only wanted to do so when they thought the child was white. And so when they were given fact patterns, right, about children who committed very serious offenses, if they thought the child was a Black child, they were more likely to favor, to endorse severe sentences like juvenile life without the possibility of parole. But when they were told that the child was a white child, when they were told that the child was a white child, they were more willing to give the child a chance in adult court or in juvenile court or in a less severe adult sentence, right? So they were more amenable to these rehabilitative alternatives for a white child than for a Black child. And then the final study that we've talked about, probably every single study, every single webinar we've had, and that is the one that all of us should know, by Dr. Philip Atiba Goff, finding that people are more likely to perceive Black children as significantly older than they actually are, by more than 4.5 years older than they actually are. That means a 15-year-old Eric Campbell was perceived to be 19, right? 19 and a half, 20 years old when he was 15. That makes it such that psychologically you have less reservation, less hesitation to impose a severe sentence, right? You don't see them in their full humanity and ask the right questions. We don't have the desire to protect them by insisting upon due process, by insisting upon a full and complete review of the evidence. That's what the research shows. So I wanted to just lay that stage because we want folks on this call to know we're not just talking anecdotes, right? We're not just talking numbers and data, right? We're talking empirical research that demonstrate the cognitive biases that we have that directly contributes to the landscape that we've been talking about today. So I wanted to, though, tie it back to the ways in which we can advocate. We're going to spend, a lot more time in a few minutes talking about reform, but I do want to ask you all, Kristen first, whether or not you have been able to use this sort of implicit racial bias research that I just summarized at various phases of the case. So how do you use that research to advocate for individual children, whether that be in the charging phase, the trial phase, the sentencing phase, or at parole hearings? Have you used any of that research?
So the main space that I've chosen to use this research is in training. We train anybody that comes through LCCR, whether it is an intern or a staff member, and it doesn't matter if they are on staff to be an attorney, a communications person. I personally do an implicit racial bias training that includes many of these studies. And so the reason for that is what you've already said. So like Eric, the experience that Eric shared with us, that his attorney wasn't even willing to share his documents with him, to talk to him. The research around implicit data would indicate to us or suggest to us that if Eric was a white child in this circumstance, that his attorney likely would have discussed these things with him, or with his parents at the very least, would have been more open to sharing these things with him. And so we share, we do this training with our staff to make sure that as defenders, we don't have blinders on, because we kind of feel like, oh yes, we know this, we are committed to this, and not recognizing our own implicit racial biases, because what we know about implicit racial biases is that they're subconscious, they're ingrained in all of us. And so, we use these trainings, but the other way that we kind of use some of this is through our motions practice. The very interesting and cool thing about our project, our jail walk project at LCCR, is that it allows us to have a robust motions practice. And so we file motions about everything, about all the issues, and we create all types of motions. And I know at least one of our attorneys not only created a complete motions packet around implicit racial biases in transfer of these cases, because there was a specific jurisdiction in Louisiana, and let's say that jurisdiction had 7 juvenile lifers. The state, after Miller and Montgomery came down and these folks had an opportunity to be resentenced, the DA in that jurisdiction did not seek LWOP sentences against any of the white juvenile lifers, but sought the sentence again against all of the Black folks in that jurisdiction. And so one of our attorneys created a motion around that to show that, listen, this is racism, this is bias. And what was really beautiful about that is that she actually, through her advocacy, convinced another attorney working in that jurisdiction to also file those motions and make that argument. So this is really, really important. And I think not more important, but as important as making sure we are using this as a tool to advocate for our clients, that we really should be using this as a tool to make sure the people who are working alongside of us are cognizant of implicit racial bias.
Excellent, excellent. Love so many examples, just eat them up. I hope everybody's paying attention. And I will note that we have a racial justice toolkit that allows folks to access defenders or youth advocates to access those sample motions for folks who are representing kids. And so if you're watching this on Zoom and you represent children, we're going to talk to Kristen and get a copy of that motion so that you can use it, something similar in your advocacy. Carmen, for those folks who are on the call who are policy advocates, right? And I'll come back. I think, well, before I ask that, Suzanne asked Kristen the question whether or not any of the motions have been successful.
Of course not.
Right.
but it does allow us the opportunity to educate the court, and also call out the DA. And then what we always hope that it does is it creates a record for us that hopefully we can take to the appellate court and maybe get more there. But no, those motions weren't successful, and we strategically made the decision not to take it up to the appellate court.
And the time has got to be right for that to make, you don't want to make bad law. But I love that question, Suzanne. We're all, wondering that. And, oftentimes these things aren't successful, especially at the beginning. We keep filing to, like Kristen said, to make the record, get up on appeal at the right time. And that over time, and we saw, the desegregation of schools, as an example. Thurgood Marshall, pressed that agenda for years before we got anywhere close to what might be considered success. And even then, it needed work, still needs work. Carmen, policy, like, have you been able to use any of this research in the policy space?
You look pained because I know it's like, ooh, how does this work in policy? I think many of you know who work in state legislatures and state houses. We are in cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs land in many of these states with some crazies elected across the country. But what we have been able to do at Advancement Project through our Police Free School campaigns, that's a national campaign to get police out of school, which gained a lot of momentum after the assault at Spring Valley, is to talk about implicit bias and how all of these police assaults are happening to Black kids. Like, let's really examine that. And there was momentum. We have a county here in Maryland, Montgomery County, that's like, we're going to get police out of schools, no more school resource officers. And then as time has gone on, and as we have seen the backlash around Black Lives Matter, right, and the narrative shift around Black youth, those places that were like, you know what, we're going to do the right thing. We're going to pivot again, and we're going to put cops back in school because of that false narrative. So it's always, one step forward, two steps back, sometimes. And that's where I feel like we're at right now. The gains from the uprisings of 2020 with Black Lives Matter, where you had that narrative, we had the corporations giving gobs of money to groups like ours and across the country to support that effort, to talk about race in this country in a way that hasn't been talked about in a long time. All of that has been like pulled from under us again. So we're fighting. We're all in the struggle from the grassroots to do this and to keep talking about implicit bias. And I think, we're just at a place where it's falling on deaf ears a little bit at the policy stage, but you keep doing it. That's the only way we've gotten such major gains in the youth justice field, is we keep pointing to the data, we keep talking about implicit bias, and we've come a long way. We're not towards abolition, which I think is the goal for many of us, but we will take these knocks, but just know we have to keep marching forward.
Yes. And so this idea about the gains being pulled out from under us in this moment, right? And it is really about the resurgence of the narrative. And Kristen, you talked about the false and exaggerated claims of rising crime committed by children, right? It's really, the data doesn't bear out what the narrative is today. We're coming, wherever we are in this pandemic, if we're coming out of the pandemic, there has been a visible, high profile sort of apparent uptick in serious crimes like carjacking or the like, but that is made visible and made to appear greater than it is by the narrative, the media narrative, the narrative of district attorneys and police departments, right? And so the question that I have for you, though, Carmen, is what are the tools that we have in pushing back on that narrative. And so you just talked about in your Police Free Schools campaign, one of the tools was the use of this research, the implicit racial bias research. It's about capitalizing on moments of outrage, like the behavior of the police officer ripping a young Black girl out of her seat in Spring Valley, South Carolina. What are some of the other tools that we can use in our policy advocacy, in our efforts to shift the narrative on this sort of resurgence of fear about Black children?
Definitely. Thank you. It's a tough question. It's hard, right? So I think we are always a little behind, right? When this crime narrative was kicking off almost two years ago around youth crime, we didn't have, forgive my French, our shit together to counter it, right? We are a smart group of people, but it took us too long to be like, okay, are we going to speak in one voice about how this is false? Who's going to do the research and actually dig into the data for us, right? And I feel like we're putting out too many fires right now during COVID. Advocates are tired. We are fighting for lives, right? Getting people out of facilities. And this is where we always need to improve ourselves as a movement, to be like, okay, this is happening. Let's get on one microphone. Let's use the same talking points around this. Who can do the data? Who can do the report for us? Are we all referencing the actual data, the report, to say youth crime is not going up? And that report just came out a couple of months ago, maybe last summer, from the Sentencing Project. It is great. It's a little late, right? Like, it's late. So we have to figure out a way as a field to corral our resources, to figure out what is that narrative conversation we want to have, the shift we want to do. And that's hard because we are doing so many different things, but we have to do it because lives are on the line, right? Policy is on the line, laws are on the line. So we have to just do a better job of that. And arming our grassroots groups with those tools who are begging for it. They're like, please, how do I talk to my sheriff? How do I talk to my representative? Like, I need that. So as national groups who have that capacity and resources, we have to really get down to the grassroots to support our comrades who are in this fight every day.
I so love that. All these very concrete, takeaways, unified voice, developing a talking points for folks, both, at grass tops and grassroots level, for folks to be using data collection, generating reports and infographics that correct the misinformation. All of this is important for those of you who are listening and thinking, oh my God, how do I do this? Where do I start? Partnering with organizations like Advancement Project, like Sentencing Project, like, some of the ACLUs, like reach out to us at the Galt Center and at the Georgetown Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative. We'll point you in the right direction, either locally or nationally, to begin to address those issues. And let me turn to you, Kristen, like for one example. I know you guys have been also fighting this narrative. And how do you get folks to pivot the frame away from the fear about Black children into what we should really be talking about?
Yeah, so that, as Carmen started off, it is hard, it is difficult, and also we are behind. And so what it is causing us to do as an organization is kind of take a step back and think about how we should be approaching this, and think about the ways in which our legislative advocacy cannot work if we aren't changing the narrative. And so we're doing this statewide advocacy, particularly every year at the legislature. But if the narrative is not changing among the constituents and the state as a whole, we are, as I like to say, hustling backwards. So what we have been trying to do is to really be intentional about our partnerships. And in particular, we have been intentional about trying to partner and connect more with youth-led organizations. And the reason for that is because these young people, these are their friends. The young people who are in the jails and the prisons, these are their friends. As a woman born and raised in New Orleans, I experienced that. I have friends who were arrested. I have friends who are currently at Angola. I have friends that were killed before when they were young and we were still very young. And so we honor and recognize that young people, one, have solutions, and two, because this is happening to young people are the most invested in these solutions. And so when we think about narrative change, we are trying to think about ways to connect young people to this narrative change. But yeah, we are seeing lots of fear in Louisiana around young people and crime. The biggest thing that has happened in Louisiana this year is about 10 children where a facility was opened at Angola specifically for young people, and about 10 young people were transferred to Angola, the former death row camp at Angola. And so, you know, we had elected officials getting on television and saying, we are so happy. This is a great day. We are so happy these children were transferred and now we can live safely and we don't have to fear for our lives anymore. So it's hard, and it's something that we are trying to figure out, but we know that we are behind, and we know that in order for us to be able to advocate in the ways that we need to advocate, narrative change is the first thing that we need to do.
Absolutely, no doubt. And then, you know, look, it is the first thing that we need to do. And I want to be clear, I want to turn to Eric, that, you know, young Black males and young Black girls and other youth of color shouldn't have to be the ones that are changing the narrative, right? They shouldn't have to be the ones tasked with that responsibility. But I do know it is a part of the work. It comes naturally, it grows naturally out of the work that you do at Spud Inc., which Marianne told us about when she introduced you. But can you say more about what Spud Inc. is, how you started it, and how you see Spud changing the narrative about Black youth in particular?
SPUD Inc. is a acronym for some people understand differently. And the intricate part about the narrative, you know, the narrative paints a picture, but there's another scale to the narrative where it leaves a stain. And that stain is in the minds of, if you take the incident where I went into the bin and I grabbed those underwears, I accepted that moment as this is how it is. And as subtle as me accepting that moment, everything after that becomes a condition. I get desensitized to that effect towards me. So Spud Inc. really started when I was released from prison. A lot of brothers looked up to me in my accolades of doing this duration of time and coming home. And I wanted to find a way that I can use this aspect in a positive way. I've always had a love for music. While incarcerated, music was the only thing that kept me sane. And when I say kept me sane, is because while in prison, you do reach that brink of insanity many times in this unnatural environment. So when I came home and I was pursuing music as a career, a lot of the brothers were gravitating to me, and I was hearing the stories. I was learning their lifestyles, and each one that I looked at, I saw me. I saw me in them. And I built the studio, started with the studio, I started very small and started inviting them in. And I realized they needed an outlet of expression. So I would share my stories with them from incarceration, freedom, courts, everything I would share with them, and they would share back to me where they were. So we had this communication that I was getting to understand them, and they get to understand me, as well as understand this narrative, this big narrative that is so subtle sometimes they don't even realize they play into it in their ways of expression. To fight against it, you actually play directly towards it. A young brother named Daryl once called me and he said he wanted to come to the studio if he could be a fly on the wall. And that day I had a paid session. And I said, you know what? Let me ask the brother if you could come. And I forgot. That day, Daryl was shot. And I realized he was shouting. He was coming to me. He didn't know how to, he was reaching for me. And I said, from that moment on, I am never going to have a space where I have to play against making a profit than making a progress. And that was the birth of Spud Inc. And I went to everyone with this, I had this great idea. I'm gonna come up with a curriculum of how we could use life imitates art. And we're gonna use the idea of creating music and editing music on how we can edit and change things in our life. Our biggest thing was energy, anger, energy, frustration. All those energies are neither positive or negative. It's the results, what you do with that energy. So we made it parallel to vocal chains and music. And I started the nonprofit with that. And I realized the gangs and everyone coming to me. And I said, you know what? I'm gonna start something. I'm gonna have them come on record and do all this together. They're gonna diss each other on record. I said, say the most malice, say everything you want. We're gonna do it together on record. And they did it, and everyone said, you're foolish, you're making a mistake. To be transparent, there was even a lawyer who was part of my last 6 years of incarceration, fighting and helping with an appeal, was one that told me that this is impossible. What you're trying to do is impossible. And I did it, and we were able to stop a war in my neighborhood and create a truce between the gangs, which now they make if you could see my wall, we have tons of plaques on my wall from all the artists that come together and make their music. And that's when it snowballed. I wanted to do more. And knowing that with the narrative, between the presentation of it and the stains, the markings that it leaves in many of our youth, going back to that moment in court where I was there and that there was this conversation being held over me, around me, but about me. I saw that a lot of times I went to places, I spoke at venues, and I was speaking about these young brothers and these young sisters in these communities. And I was speaking for them, around them, over them, and not with them. And that's when I said, I have to stay patched in, as we call it, between the two worlds and introduce those worlds. And that's kind of the basis. I'm sorry, I get passionate about this. This is the basis of Spud Inc. And every brother that I know that was up north that I did time with, 90% of my friends now that come to my daughter's birthdays and celebrate Christmas with me are brothers that I was incarcerated at 15. When they come home, we all get together and we add to this mission. We have this thing where we say, they say we have to pay a debt to society, but now we owe a debt to us. And now we just pay it. And that's Spud Inc. in a snowball.
Wow, my heart is full, so full, so full. Your passion just, it screams out, and I love what you're doing. All the things that you said, making sure folks who are coming out understand the narrative, not be defined by the narrative, negotiate through and around that narrative to their success. And we see it in you, and I love it so incredibly much. Reba put in the chat the link to Spud Inc. so you can learn even more for folks who are listening. Also, I urge y'all to donate. Look, it's the end of the year. This is the time. Make your donations to this now. We wanted to hit one more area that is just so important, and it ties to something you said, that the toll that being inside, Eric, takes on the young folks that come out. And they come out as quote unquote as adults, right? Who've spent their childhood inside. And so they're coming out with a significant toll, a mental health toll, a compromise in many ways in their development, right? Their sense of self is at question. Their lack of opportunities for education for some folks, right? Particularly those in states with prisons without an educational program. And so what I wanted to at least make sure folks on this call know, right, is a little bit more about what it looks like from the inside. And, Carmen said something earlier about the relationships, right? You're now deprived of all these important connections with your family, peers at school, in your neighborhood community. And so if you could say a bit about your relationships and just your experience on the inside.
Yes, oh, most definite. One of the things that when I speak about this, I try to make people hold clearly is you take a 15-year-old, a 13-year-old, and you place him in this environment, he is still developing, he or she is still developing the sense of themselves. So not only are they affected by the absence of the relationships, they are still building the connections and the relationships they have. So you're detached from that. And then you're placed in an environment where there's no manual, there's no rule book. You go into this pipeline, and when they use the word system, like when I hear it, automatically everything, the process comes to mind, because you see the process of the system, the assembly belt. The relationships are difficult, not only in the ones that you know, but in the social relationships. You're sent miles away in these facilities that don't even have channels to watch the news that you're associated with or read the books. There's a lot of restraints on the books that you can get to read that could keep you. So you're stuck in this place. You take a 15-year-old, no work history, no relationship examples to a full, and then you release them. Once a person is incarcerated at any age, what happens is life as they know it in experience stop. So you have a 15-year-old me. By the time I was released at 28, my experience stopped at 15, regardless if I went to college in prison. And then you release this person and say, do the right thing. I'm still, now I have to build a relationship of me as a free man, despite the narratives of the rap sheet, trying to find a job, introducing you now with the absence of you in the household. The family grows in a relationship of distance. Now you have to build a relationship together, understanding the do's and don'ts, the likes, what I like. I remember the first day home, they gave me a menu at a restaurant. That was one of the most stressful moments as a free man, looking at the menu. It was so much things to choose from. Some of them I didn't even know what that was, And so the breakdown of incarceration, and I lower my tone in this because it really hits home. The fact that you set or place someone in this environment with no reconstruction, no additives, and you surround yourself, quote unquote, you surround them with people who are not fit for society, right? You place them in this environment where everyone's a troublemaker or everyone belongs here, and then you say when they release, they should do the right thing. That in itself is a design for failure. And then for juveniles, there is no transitional services. So while I was incarcerated, I took every program you could think of. Small engines, which was to repair lawnmowers. I don't have grass in Brooklyn. I took everything you can name. And then when you get out, you're left with whatever it is you had to fight you against. So that setting has so many full designs, because when you're being released, there's no middle person. Even the psychological evaluations of a person, many of the brothers that I know that we've had to sit down and, every month we all get together and we call it a suicide check. That's a phrase in prison where the officers go to your door and check on you. We actually do that because the psychological boom, it's a spike. It's a spike. So you're stripped of a moment. You fill this time up with aggression, tension, racism, hate, disparity, fear, frustration, and then you're freed. You never coped with what you dealt with. There's no conversation of release. So now you take this baggage with you into a world, and now you got to take that baggage, which people are pointing at that baggage, so you can't do something. You have new hurdles. And a lot of times that's very difficult to deal with. And it forces that I'm going to do what I know, or I'm going to try this, and sets the tone to repeat something, going back into that narrative. So if I had to ball up, and I'm very long-winded about this part, but if I had to ball up the time incarcerated, everything that I experienced was a setup for failure.
That's such a powerful, powerful statement that everyone should hear. Set up for failure.
Yeah.
Set up for failure, right? And it's just, I mean, look, there's research for folks who are interested in, the horrible conditions of confinement, from, food, diet, lack of toiletries, temperature too hot, too cold, lack of sunlight, use of restraints, solitary confinement. And I'm going to ask one of my colleagues.
Yeah.
Yeah, to put in the chat, I want folks on your own time, to watch the story of Nisi Fennell. We talk about girls, we, don't lift up girls as much, but, young Nisi Fennell at the age of, 16, accused of being an accessory because she was driving a car in which two people, unbeknownst to her, shot someone. She ends up incarcerated, pending trial, in jail, right? And she ends up taking her own life. Solitary confinement. So understanding what it means to be a girl in jail. And you talked about Suicide Watch, is really the tie that I wanted to make with Nisi Fennell, is how incredibly traumatizing it is. It leads to suicide. And so I want folks to watch that. And then solitary confinement, right? So when you have a child like a Nisi Fennell or a Kalief Browder, right? Folks remember his story, 16-year-old accused of robbery in New York City, and he insisted that he didn't do it, refused to plead guilty to something that he didn't do, gets held in jail, pending trial, without a trial, for 3 years, most of which was in solitary confinement. He too gets out and commit suicide. And this is what, you're talking about, Eric, this notion of, let me do Suicide Watch with my cohort, with the folks that I know who came out, because we've lived through such trauma, such horrific conditions, such a, just a ridiculous, barriers to healthy development. And then you're going to put us out with all of our baggage, and expect us to thrive. Right. And yes, please jump in, Eric.
Just to tap in on solitary confinement, which I've spent in solitary confinement 3 different periods of time. One of the most loudest sounds in the world is silence. It has this ring that never ends. There's no escaping it. So in solitary confinement, usually when you on the solitary confinement block, you hear these screams and these moans and people banging and screaming. And the officers say this phrase, or they're going insane. It's the monkey house. That they'll literally walk down and say this stuff. But all those screams, all those banging and throwing stuff and moans, is everyone holding on to their sanity. And for me, it was music. I would scream to the top of my lungs as soon as I wake up. Every song I could remember, every song I written, I needed sound. And I didn't understand how important not just having the conversation with another human being, but sound was. And that is another reason why in my organization, we use sound, because that's why I say it kept me sane.
Wow. Your story is so powerful. And I think understanding all the layers, right, that you have shared with us, from, the circumstances that led to your arrest in the first place as an adolescent, right, caught up, somewhere with a friend that you didn't want to leave because you didn't want to look like a wuss, all the way to, the lawyering, the lack, of representation that you had, the imposition of a severe sentence that just doesn't match, all of the potential that you had and that we see, the horrible conditions, fear, solitary confinement. And we're just so, I'm just pleased to know you and blessed to know you and how you've overcome that and are using what your experience is to shepherd so many other people through. I feel emotional as I say it. But the way we like to end this, we want to end with just giving each of you, an opportunity to just share, some closing words of wisdom, right? First of all, how do we prevent children, not children anymore, but children like the 15-year-old Erics from ever being in that space? That's one really important question. And I mean that policy-wise, legislatively, I mean that, in terms of litigation, both individual and class action litigation, as well as, and then once kids, because we've got kids who are there now, who are emerging as adults, how do we help them out? So just your closing words of wisdom in that space. And maybe I'll start, I'll start with you at the national level, Carmen, if you will, and then maybe Kristen at the state level and Eric.
Yeah.
Close.
I think the strategy of our opposition is for us to lose hope that we can't do this, for all the dings we've had over the last few years when there was a little bit of hope and momentum. So we keep fighting, right? We burn it down. Like, this system was built to harm us, to traumatize us, built on the first youth prisons were built right after Reconstruction, right? As soon as we got free, they locked young people up. So I say, keep fighting. We talk about accountability for young people and what that means through this criminal justice system, but we never talk about accountability of the system itself. No one ever rates a prison to say, you know what, you're not meeting these standards, let's shut it down. No, but it's all on the young person. So we need to come up with stronger strategies to shut it down. Because I will say, just working around the edges is not going to do it. And we're going to keep young Black people behind bars. So keep fighting, keep reaching out, keep networking. Like, let's think of new strategies to get this done. And thank you all. And thank you, Eric, for all you're doing and what you've been through. Thank you.
I love it. And there's a perfect way to start. Like, Carmen is like, burn the thing down, burn it down, abolitionist, boom. And then, I imagine, like, and I hear you 100, like, tinkering around the edges alone is not enough. That said, there's those of us, we're in the trenches and we're fighting for kids one by one. And so let me turn to you, Kristen. What do we do? I mean, until the Carmens of the world help us burn it down and Erics of the world share their story so that people, want to burn it down, right? What do we do?
Burn it down. Second that. And then I just say what I always say to people here as I'm having discussions is, change starts with us. And so, like, on a personal level, treat children like children. When you see a young person, a young Black male or a young Black girl out on the street or in your neighborhood, speak to them, engage with them, talk to them, ask them, do they need anything? If they need something and you can provide it for them. If you aren't able to provide it, help them figure out a way to get it. But too often I see people walk past and over teenagers and not acknowledge them, not greet them, or greet them in a way that is passive and doesn't really engage them. Engage with them, look them in their eyes, let them know, I see you. Hello, how are you today? Smile at them. If they, sometimes I walk past a young person, hey, how you doing? I say, I was talking to you. I'm like, how you doing today? And really engage them and let them know that you love them and you care about them and you want them to be well. So for me, it really starts with this individual behavior, because we could go out here and tell everybody what to do, but unless we're doing it ourselves, we don't have much room to talk.
I love it.
And thank you so much for all of this. And thank you, Eric, for sharing your story.
Absolutely. I love it. So we got abolition on the table. We've got treatment of children like children. And I love, Kristen, this notion, the antidote to dehumanization is humanity. Treating folks like humanity. I love that. I love that. I'm going to throw in one before I pass it to Eric. The lawyer in me is like, we've got to fight. We have to fight. I'm with y'all on abolition. In the meantime, I'm going to continue to fight in the courts, class action suits, equal protection challenges to transfer laws, state constitutional challenges, arguing that these severe sentences are cruel and unusual punishment, challenge felony murder that Eric talked about, challenge the whole framework, challenge the conditions of confinement, shut down solitary confinement, whether that's by policy or legislative reform, partner with organizations like ACLU, all of it, media campaigns, data collection. You've heard such wonderful words of wisdom, but I wanted to jump in because I want Eric to close us out. I want Eric to bring us home. Final words of wisdom that you want to share with the folks who are thinking about the ways in which Black and brown children are dehumanized. What do we got to do?
We have to burn the candle on both ends. There's a political, governmental state of it, and then there's a social state of it. And everyone said, we got to fight. We got to partner up. We got to acknowledge our people, our youth, and we got to huddle up. There's this football phrase when they call the huddle, right? Everyone huddle. Even the bench players get on the huddle. And then when the huddle breaks, the players go on the field. But the guys on the bench, they're screaming, they chant. They got a job to do as well. And everyone's playing a part. So there's some players on the field, and people might feel they have a more important role or a more active role, and they might have that. And that's perfectly fine. But all the players on the team wanting that goal, that field goal, is the mission. So when we get together in forums like this or outside of this or come across people, we need to get in that huddle. And we need to work everyone's strength to maximize what we can do, because together it's more powerful than the individual points that we can make. If we all put our buckets together, we gonna win.
Wow, wow, wow. I'm completely teared up. And we're gonna close this out. Everybody should see this. Everybody should see this. Everybody should see Eric's stories. For those of you who are still on the Zoom, share widely. I hope it's not inappropriate. I love you, Eric.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for this moment. Thank you for the work everyone does. Like, it all adds to it. I usually take these moments and I run back to my brothers and I share everything that's going on to ignite that fire, because sometimes we do feel alone.
That's right. That's right. We all feel alone in this struggle. Folks who've been formerly incarcerated, impacted by the system, and the advocates, we've been talking about it. So thank you, Carmen, for just being a light. You've done decades, look, as just a decade of work, advocating for change. And we just thank you, Kristen, thank you for being in the trenches and being a model, training other folks for being in the trenches. So you all have a great night.